Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Spiritual revelations, sexual alchemy, past lives, esoteric teachings, and alchemical keys to transcendence. Welcome to the final episode in our three-part series of revelationary conversations with internationally acclaimed astrologer, ceremonial teacher, Mayan calendar researcher, and best-selling author, Barbara Hand Clow. Previous discussions of the first two books in her Revelations Trilogy covered a number of well-researched topics, from secret societies, mysterious cults and sexual abuse and corruption in the Catholic Church, to Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and sacred sex as a path to the divine. And it's all masterly woven into an intricately layered and exciting fictional or factional narrative. Barbara Hand Clow, welcome.
Hi, Sandie. Good to see you.
So now we get to the final episode of the story, but of course not humanity's story.
It's been a long journey, hasn't it?
It has. It's been an interesting one. I mean, you spent, the book itself covered a 10-year span from 2011 all the way up to 2021, and I'm sure it took you a long time to write the books. But in Book 3, Revelations from the Source, we discover the connections between current events like environmental collapse, schisms in the Catholic Church, the refugee crisis, political breakdown in the United States, the shift out of the age of oil to the high-tech economy, and the COVID pandemic, and the coming shift from 5D through to 9D consciousness. Wow. That's quite a lot that you've packed into these three books. And it's been interesting because you kind of knew what was coming as an astrologer, but I don't think you knew exactly how things were going to pan out, did you?
Yeah, astrologers can tell when there's a moment in time where there's going to be maybe great transformation, maybe great change, whatever quality is predicted by the planets. But what we can't tell. And so, of course, we watch very closely as we get closer and closer to the time to see what's going on, because that's when we can start to get a sense of the quality of what might happen. So the only thing that I knew when I started the trilogy back in 2010 by analyzing astrology was that our world was going to crack for some reason in January of 2020. And so it's such a profound cycle. It's actually a 735-year cycle. And in that 735-year cycle, every time it comes around, we have a whole new system that comes into play on the planet. And all kinds of old things are thrown away, such as what we see these days with the Great Restart. And so all I knew is that moment was coming, but I knew something else also. Since I studied the elite and the cabal controlling our planet or having a huge influence on our planet for most of my life, I knew that they would be using it and they'd be planning with it. And we have all kinds of evidence for that sort of thing, which I won't go into. But we knew that this was going to happen. And so I decided I needed to, go deeply from 2010 to like the first two books. I needed to go deeply into what was going on from like 2010 through about 2016, 2017, in order to pick out the elements that really mattered. Because somehow or another, I could be sure that when the real crack came in, when the real systems change came into place, what would happen would be that it would be comprised of most of those elements. And so I needed to describe that building wave, still not knowing exactly what would happen. So by picking, as it turns out, now that all the work is done, by picking the correct forces that were influencing our reality the most during the current 735-year cycle, which is like 1285 AD to 2020 AD. Isn't that amazing? And so, fortunately, I picked the right ones, such as what was going on in the Catholic Church, what was going on with global politics, what was going on with environmental issues, so that as I got closer and closer to the time and was ready to write source, fortunately, I not only had the right characters, because that was my creative choice in terms of who I was going to work with, but I also did have the right elements to work with, which helped a lot.
It is a very complex series of books, and you wrote that once COVID-19 broke out in early 2020, the human heart was pierced with uncontrollable fear brought on by the powers that be that released a pandemic designed to reduce the human race to utter enslavement. Mm-hmm. Now, were they planning all of this, creating all of this, or were they simply responding to a situation that they knew helped, supported their agenda?
Well, for example, regarding COVID, there's lots of evidence that people were working on viruses and potential manipulation by means of viruses for at least 20 or 30 years. But let's see, I lost my train of thought because I went right to COVID. Oh, okay. So going back to the planners and the people who were really working to influence society, they work with economic control, they work with financial control, they work with territorial control at a time like this in order to be in a position of power. And so what we see is back around, I'm not sure the exact date of the foundation of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab's group. But we start to see the appearance of these power groups of billionaires who are setting themselves up to control different facets of our reality. And one of them is certainly public health. And as it turned out, what triggered the crack in our planet was a supposed pandemic. I think there are real issues with whether this would have been nearly as bad as it was if they hadn't adopted the policies that they adopted. But it's all they needed as the central tool, because meanwhile, what goes on in the collective mind, the public mind, is people actually do feel these astrological transits, and they feel these long trends. And they, like all the way from 2010 on, people started getting a little bit nervous, feeling like something was a little bit off, something was changing in a way that we didn't understand. And then that feeling just built and built as those transits came into play. So it's an interesting issue of how do you trigger fear? Well, if people are anxious and worried about what's coming next, they're more prone to problems like that, which is the reason I'm a teacher about precession of the equinoxes. I'm a teacher of these 2,000-year cycles, like the age of Aries from 2000 to 0 AD, and then the age of Pisces that we've just gone out of, and now we're going into Aquarius. Because the only way that you can really anticipate how this might work to the point where you can get beyond fear. Like Sandie, I have not been fearful in the middle of this. I've been very annoyed by restrictions and very upset by the manipulation of the people around me. But I haven't been personally upset and fearful, because I've understood that a process is going on, and that the more we can kind of flow with it, understand it, learn from it, the better off the planet's going to be, which is really is the theme of the trilogy. It's a teaching book, you know?
Well, we all know, because we're witnessing it on a daily basis, that there seems to be a dissolution of everything, morals, behavior, tolerance. In our culture, everything seems to be falling apart. With so many reports of celebrities on stage, people throwing things at them or interrupting performances, or people on planes and in public places behaving in ways that, my goodness, our parents would have been appalled at. So is that also, do you think, a response to the fear that people are feeling, or is that something else?
I certainly think that collective fear splits people into good and evil and black and white, and put one side of the egg or the other. And so what has happened historically, and on precession, we actually have information going back 12,000 years. So we actually know a lot about how these ages change, and I present as much of that information as I can because it's been very suppressed, because it's actually the key to human freedom. And so what happens, no matter what, is when we get to the end of an age, there is a tremendous breakdown in dissolution in morals and in finance and in general human behavior. And people just have a hard time with change. They really struggle with it unless they have some idea of what might be going on. And so one of the most interesting aspects of that issue in our current shift from the age of Pisces into Aquarius is that the age of Pisces is the age of organized religions, using power on the planet by means of religions to control people and to control society. And isn't it interesting, if even though the Pope is in the news and we hear stuff about things going on in churches, isn't it interesting that that isn't a central topic at this point? Because all of the organized religions are suffering a loss of their members, a loss of financial support, which is exactly what's predicted by the end of the age of Pisces. And it's not that religion and contact with faith in God is going away. It's not about that. It's about these large controlling religions that have influenced us so heavily for the last 2,000 years. So isn't it interesting that that isn't a huge theme in thoughtful magazines, like maybe Atlantic Monthly, you pick what you want. Isn't it interesting there isn't more reflection on what it does to people when they lose their faith? Because that's where the fear comes from. People have lost their feeling of being in touch with what they believe supports them during their lifetimes.
Absolutely. A big unraveling there. I want to revisit a topic that we did cover last month when you spoke about Atlantis. You said that those ancient legends are repositories of repressed human memory that is denied because of the horror attached to them, but they're still stored in our DNA and in our racial memory. And that these traumas are set to go off like bombs now that the Aquarius age has come in. Was that always planned, or are is there a greater plan, or are we just at the mercy of whatever, the astrology and the different eras, the eons are, expressing with the, the aspects of the planets?
Well, that's a really hard question, isn't it, to answer? But we can identify, and this is what's most relevant to us, I think, right now. We do know that we're in the middle of this 26,000 year precession cycle. There's like 12 of these great ages, and basically 23,000 years, 26,000 years long. So we know that that's something that's been going on because we can detect it in culture and history and archaeology and all of that. And so then the interesting thing about that particular cycle is there's a low point and a high point. And the high point was 26,000 years ago. And right now we're at actually, I'd rather revise that, from 26,000 years ago until about 12,000 years ago, because that was a long cycle where everything built up and became more advanced and developed more. And now we're at the opposite point to that long development that crashed in 12,000 years ago. So the reason that so many scientists, as well as esotericists and occultists and all that, have been predicting that this particular cycle change would be especially traumatic is because we're at the half point when things crashed before. So we're at the half point from the fall of Atlantis, or some kind of advanced, or possibly many advanced cultures on this planet around 12,000 years ago. Now, this is not New Age woo-woo and mythology. Scientists finally, over the last 30 years, have done a lot of research on various issues around 11,500 years ago that involved, there's about 4 basic theories of whether an asteroid did it, whether a comet did it, whether over too much ice on the poles did, whatever. There's different theories, but these theories are all very scientific. And even though it's difficult to be sure exactly when it happened, we've nailed it within like 500 years, which is pretty amazing when you consider the spans of time here. So we know something happened, but we don't know what caused it, but it doesn't matter. Where my research has gone, I'm a teacher and researcher in consciousness. And so what I've always been interested in is we know something happened that almost destroyed our planet and also affected the whole solar system. So it isn't just Earth, it's also the whole solar system. So we know that that happened. And then my issue is, what did that do to the people who were living on the planet at the time? And this is where I've gotten into a lot of research in the fall, and then the maybe 3,000-4,000 years of slow survivalism afterwards. Sometimes I think the survivalist period around 6, 7, 8, 9,000 BC might have been the worst. I'm not sure I would want to live through something like this, but heroically and amazingly, different clans and different races and different species on this planet survived it and began to rebuild culture again. And we're living in a time at the pinnacle of that culture, because something is going to happen. Now, here's where it gets interesting. It may not just be a physical wipeout like it was before. In fact, I don't think so. I think what's going on is more an emotional, social meltdown. And I actually think it's harder than being blown up in an earthquake or a volcano. I think the emotional processing that we're going through right now is intense. And by the way, I coined a term for it. It's called catastrophobia, fear of catastrophes. And so we're waking up at this point in the middle of this crazy ending of, for example, the power of organized religion. We're also waking up to the fact that we are a multi-traumatized species, and that we're recovering from our trauma. And that's the hardest part of it. And so the characters, that particular theory that you and I are talking about right now, isn't really discussed very much in this trilogy. But all of the characters are going through various forms of waking up from the catastrophobia. And really better word maybe in this case would be amnesia. And as we wake up, just like with early childhood abuse, as we wake up and remember what happened to us, then we go through a lot of processing. And it's a collective processing. And that's why people are going nuts on the streets, throwing things at celebrities up on the stage. People are just losing it because they don't know what's the matter with them.
You spoke also last month about Atlantis and the lie that was given, and so many people, have trauma. I personally know people who are healers who have said that they are very scared of using their healing. They like to keep a tight rein on it because they're afraid that they could just let things go and that they would repeat some things that they did that weren't very good back in Atlantis. Now, these people have got this in their head that they did something really awful at that time, and so they've got to keep a tight rein on what they're doing now. I mean, is that something that's true?
Well, first of all, I find this really interesting because I've run into the same thing. And the basic archetypal theory is that back in Atlantis, we got to be really powerful with healing and crystals and all that. And then finally, somebody blew up a great big crystal, which set off the whole cataclysm. Well, that sounds like human ego to me, because to tell you the truth, this is a solar system cataclysm, as it is now. By the way, there are major changes on all of the planets for the last 40, 50 years. It's happening, so to speak. But here's what's really, I think, much more important. most of the people who buy into the idea that humans destroyed the earth, have we heard that one lately called carbon issues? So what's happening
Yes.
now? See, what's happening now is the cabal and the global elite. You know, first of all, the goal of the cabal and the people in control is to control people. Because if people have enough freedom and creativity and all that, they're not going to deal with all the kind of BS that the cabal puts down on us. So objective number one on the part of the World Economic Forum and the cabal, et cetera, and the Vatican is to control people. Well, there's only one sure way they've figured out so far to control people, and it's called guilt. So last time around, people bought into the idea that they blew up the planet with crystal technology. And now this time, as the planet goes through a natural cataclysmic cycle, look, climate change is real. But the issue is the cause. It's never been an issue of being real. It's a real thing. And so now, what are we going to hear 12,000 years from this moment forward? We're going to hear that planets destroyed the earth, humans destroyed the earth because they created too much carbon in the atmosphere. And then, of course, the cabal gets paid for the carbon credits and corporations. So it's just so important not to buy into guilt. I didn't do anything except live a creative life and have a family and do everything I can for my world. And I don't have anything to feel guilty about, you know? Really important stuff.
It's so interesting because we hear about these people, the cabal, and we think of them as monsters, and you know all they care about is power. I don't know what they actually get from power, because if you've got power, it's never enough. But you know, when you look at a tiny baby, you would never dream that that child is going to grow up to be somebody, you know, like Schwab or somebody else. So, what is actually happening along the route to growing up to that person to make them want to
Well,
all of this power and control?
you're edging on to an interesting question about my trilogy, which a lot of people have questioned. A lot of people have said, why are you describing really free, very wealthy, very powerful people as good people? Because about half of the characters in this trilogy are on the level of people in the cabal. But every wealthy person is not part of the cabal. In fact, I bet if you could get the incomes of everybody on the planet and split it down the middle, I bet it's 50-50, yin and yang, good and evil. So even though I know a whole lot about what people like Anthony Fauci and Bezos and everybody else have been doing, it's not like it isn't obvious what they're all doing. They're totally blatant about it. But in the meantime, there are all kinds of really, really great people who do have power and influence, who use it throughout their whole lives to assist their families and the planet. So I wanted to make that point because I've known so many good aristocratic people, and I know of so many really bad people who have a lot of power and money.
Well, we
Yeah.
all have choice, and you know, we can choose to be good or we can choose not to be good.
Yeah.
But you also spoke about the archons, and we've talked about them before. And you said the archons told global leaders they would be saved by stealth crafts that would take them to underground bases on Mars during
Right.
the cataclysms, and the elites believe they will depart secretly to Mars
Yeah.
while the final drama unfolds. Well, that's exactly what we're watching. You know, they're all talking about, you know, wanting to be the first to get to Mars. So where did you get that information from?
About the archons?
Yeah.
Information about the archons. Okay, the archons are an issue that was very, very important to the Gnostics. The Gnostics are a religious sect that was very powerful on this planet 2,000 years ago. And the Gnostics actually traced the sources of their wisdom way back for 10,000 years. In other words, all the way through this cycle of development. But what happened to the archons is the archons were really trying to expose and describe and even take down the people in power who were very, very negative. And I also could say beings in power, because there's a real question when we get up to these really high levels of power, even in the modern age, just exactly how human these people are. And I really don't know what to do with that. And in my system, it's an issue of a person being in the third dimension, but also in the fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension is the dimension of the collective mind, of the archetypal realm. So what do we want to say about the archons? It's really very similar to things now. We could say Bill Gates is an archon if you're so inclined. But what's interesting about the Gnostics is that their deepest levels of theology really try to figure out who are these people, where do they come from, how do they get away with what they're getting away with. So it would be as if in our modern age, we could finally just put, let's say, I'm not going to name any more names, but put 12 of them all in one room. And maybe this is what's going to happen with some of these indictments, where you try to nail 19 people at once. If we just put them all in a room and nail them, maybe we could figure out why. First of all, the question is, why do you do this? You don't need any more money. You don't need any more power. You're just making an absolute fool of yourself at the public level. So why do you do this? And this is what the Gnostics were great. And of course, the problem was for the church, because go back 2,000 years, and we have the Gnostics, and we have different religious sects, and we have the Christians, and we have Jews, and Islamic. Oh, they weren't here yet. They came soon. And so the church completely muzzled and destroyed the works of the Gnostics, because the Gnostics were a great threat to Roman Catholicism. Well, why were they a threat to Roman Catholicism? And this is where, when we process the religions of the age of Pisces, we can see that one of the greatest sources of the power of evil on our planet is the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that doesn't mean that individual Catholics and believers are part of this whole thing. We're talking about the inner secret realms. And as an ex-Catholic, I was Catholic, I really wanted to expose as much of that as I could. I could have done the same thing in any major religion on this planet, because the source of power and control during Pisces has been religion. But I decided to go after the religion I came from, because I just decided to do that.
Yeah. We're going to take a short break now. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is internationally acclaimed astrologer, Mayan calendar researcher, and best-selling author Barbara Hand Clow. And we're discussing the final explosive volume in her fact-ional Revelations Trilogy. We'll be back with more from Barbara Hand Clow in a few moments, so stay tuned.
OMTimes TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself, invest in your brand, and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. OMTimes Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, OMTimes offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an OMTimes magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on OMTimes TV and broadcasting it across the extensive OMTimes radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. OMTimes. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes' flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor, and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked what's really worth reading and what's not. So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who have walked this path before you.
There's no catch, no fees and no BS, just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
I wanted to talk to you about a program called the Dream Arc and a retreat that we're doing, and I want to invite you along. And the Dream Arc is a dream technology. And even the latest physics is suggesting now that reality is not what we think it is, that it's kind of a construct. And that the Dream Arc teaches us how to use the full operating system to navigate our brain frequencies between waking and sleeping and dreaming, and to move through the inner realms and the outer realms seamlessly. And you will work in the Dream Arc with certain animals that will come to you, maybe in real life, maybe through your intuition, in magical ways, or perhaps through, just dreams that come to you. It's filled, the Dream Arc, with invitations and suggestions and tasks that you choose intuitively. You choose the ones for you. You don't know what you're choosing, but they come to you. So please join us as we dive down the wormhole into the Dream Arc, and let's see what happens.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Barbara Hand Clow. In the first 2 books, we follow our characters who go through a number of experiences and kind of transmutations along the way. And by the time we get to the 3rd book, all of them have been changed in many ways. And then, of course, the book tracks COVID, which happens to them as it happens to us. You were writing that at the same time. Tell us where the book goes from there.
Well, once we get to this point where we're seeing the characters grow and change and mature, and by the way, that's not done very often in a lot of fiction. A lot of fiction is just tearing people up and collapsing them. And so I'm going against the grain, first of all, by describing people who are growing and improving. But in my experience, in my lifetime this time, anyone can grow and change. It's a choice, and it's a dedicated work, and you can do it. So once we get into the point where we see them as people who have struggled, but also are growing and changing, then we start to approach the crack in reality coming next. And so this is where in sources, it was a really hard book to write, because what I had to do is I had to almost have a running commentary in the background on what was happening out in the world, kind of like when you're in your kitchen cooking breakfast and you've got the radio running. And it had to be captivating and interesting and relatively short. So the novel switches into these characters changing and coping with reality as reality is starting to crack. And then what happens is we get a really good view, in my opinion, of how people do respond, and a really good read, as far as I'm concerned, on what we were all experiencing 2019 through 2021, when everything was just falling apart. And of course, it's still going. But I really wanted to show that I wanted it to see it as it functioned, and I did it that way.
It's said that Revelations from the Source offers an in-depth experience of alchemical transmutation to cleanse old parts of the psyche and clear space for the shift to 5D through 9D consciousness. Can you tell me a bit more about that? What does that actually look like? What will we experience
Yeah,
when reading the book.
we are all actually experiencing it, all of us in varying degrees. And the best way to show that is to think of, okay, let's talk about those dimensions for a minute. This is the third dimension, linear space and time. And then the fourth dimension is the collective mind, which is affecting our collective thoughts and our collective change. And then once we go out of that collective mind, then we start to move into the heart. And the book is very heart-centered in the sense that we do move into finer frequencies and we start to open our heart. So the dimensions, Sandie, that we feel the most palpably are the kind of the place to start, because dimensions are really subtle. And so let's take the second dimension, which is right below the third dimension, linear space and time. The second dimension is the tectonic realm, and the whole world that exists under the crust of our planet down to the center of our planet and the center of the earth. And the first dimension is the center of the earth, which is the center of everything for us on the planet. And then it also links us to the cosmic levels, because the ninth dimension is the galactic center. So this is just for people in our solar system and on our planet. So the dimensions that we understand the best are the second dimension, because of earthquakes and volcanoes and magma and microbes and all that. All those things are functioning in the second dimension. And as a matter of fact, we're in the middle at the current moment of a second dimensional upheaval, because when the second dimension gets riled up by means of human behavior, it actually activates viruses and microbes. And this is why you actually see things like pandemics. And so we understand the second dimension pretty well. We've even tested it scientifically to some extent. We certainly understand the third dimension very well. And we all know that we're being manipulated and controlled and affected by the collective mind. So just by showing the characters responding to those first three levels, first of all, we start to see more about how that works, because this trilogy is actually aimed at making people more conscious of 9 dimensions of consciousness. And the reason I think it's so important to become more conscious is those 9 dimensions are what hold us in form. It's what actually contains our real existence, all the way to the galactic center, the Milky Way, all the way down to the center of the Earth. And I'll also say, whether I write anything or not, people are becoming more conscious because they're all being activated. Tremendous activation going on right now of consciousness, like in the higher levels of consciousness, opening the heart in the fifth dimension, geometrical formation of our reality in the sixth dimension, sacred geometry and plants and nature and music. And then the seventh dimension, the activation of the sixth dimension by means of sound. And then the eighth dimension, we start to get into the divine and into the issue of God. And this is actually where religion belongs. The problem right now is religion has been in the fourth dimension for 2,000 years, controlling us by means of guilt. When in fact, we are meant to be free beings and free citizens of the galaxy itself by means of contact with the divine mind. So I'm actually a really religious person, even though I completely blasted the Catholic Church. I'm after systems that are negative, but the issue, the dimension, is of supreme importance. And then the ninth dimension is the center of the galaxy. And then I think there are lots more dimensions beyond this, but what I've received in my teaching my whole life is right now we really only can detect those 9.
You develop multidimensionality as a major theme in your book, Alchemy of the 9 Dimensions. And the characters in Revelations are very multidimensional and, become even more so as the books go on. Is that your way of showing readers how we too are multidimensional and how we might be able to expand that?
Yeah, well, see, you just nailed why I went to fiction. Because the great thing about fiction is, as a reader, we get to befriend the characters, we get to love them, we become very emotionally involved with them. So as they go through different experiences in the novel, what happens is we're learning through those experiences, we're learning things ourselves. It's just that the field of learning that I chose is kind of complex. And the books in that sense are very much ahead of themselves. But it's changing fast. Just since the books came out, I'm really only starting to really understand them myself. Fortunately,
it strikes me.
Unfortunately, that's the thing about fiction. It can entertain you and
Yes.
kind of beguile you into spending some time thinking about something you normally just go, don't bother with that, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you can read a book and you can get an awful lot. You can get an awful lot triggered, just by certain things that you read about. But there comes a point where, certainly as far as I'm concerned, I want more. I want the course. I want to be taken through some of those experiences that you describe, because I want to not just imagine them, but actually experience them myself. So have you thought about doing a course?
Well, that's so great you bring that up, because fortunately I'm now 80 years old, and fortunately other teachers have taken up teaching the material, because Jerry and I, my husband Jerry and I, taught Pleiadian agenda activations for 25 years. We taught them all over the planet at major sacred sites, and we taught thousands of students what it's like to actually be in these dimensions, because I have the ability to take people into the dimensions. And so then what was I going to do next? Because I can't be out there teaching workshops forever. Well, first of all, the most important thing is other teachers are starting to work with the teaching dimensionality. And then in my case, I switched to fiction because I figured the last thing that I could do would be to create an experiential teaching about these dimensions. And did you find yourself sometimes feeling those dimensions as you read? Could you tune in?
It's a while since I read them. I don't know. I don't think I can answer that.
Yeah.
It's hard to remember. I certainly knew that I wanted, more. Give me some more. Give me an experience. It's interesting because, I was thinking about how you tell truth in a world that is built on lies, when simple words like disclosure become weighted with derisive comments of the conspiracy theory kind. And formerly trusted media outlets, they've forgotten what journalism really is all about. But I'm seeing that by writing truth and melding it into the fiction as well, you can get people's attention a lot more. And there's quite a few people who are beginning to do this now, which is really interesting. And it's a fabulous way of triggering people and opening them up.
Yeah. And I was very much inspired by Dan Brown. I'm so grateful to him because he made it. First of all, you couldn't publish stuff like this, but because Dan Brown's books did so well, publishers were forced to start paying more attention. And even I had a lot of publisher resistance, even though I'd already published 10 or 11 or 12 other books before, just because you can't do that. Well, it's really what it really is. It's the suppression of esoteric information. And in fiction, it's hard. It's funny when it's factual, so-called. You can suppress it, but if it's in fiction, somebody can just say, "Well, it's just a story."
Yeah. But still, it has an impact. It may be just a story, but it provokes thought, and then it goes further. So, obviously, there are so many people waking up now, and there are so many teachers teaching all kinds of things that we need. How can we know where to go? Who, is the best teacher? How we can access these alchemical keys and the wisdom that's going to help us transcend.
Well, see, our souls are guiding us. And so another awakening that's going on right now is the awareness. And this is by means of especially Dr. Newton's work on life between lives. We're undergoing a therapeutic teaching that is starting to show people what their soul is, how it inhabits them, how it influences them, and all that. And the more you're aware of your soul, and the more you get to know it, and the more you're in contact with it, the more it will guide you. You know, and like the other day, I had to spend a whole day working on problems of whether extraterrestrials are really here and are they real and what are they doing and all that. And because I work so multidimensionally, I try to avoid it as much as possible. Well, I got up in the morning and opened my window, and there was a praying mantis, a beautiful 6-inch long praying mantis on my window screen. And that praying mantis stayed there all day. I watched him all day while I was working. And finally, around 2 o'clock, I just said, I've just had it. Obviously, praying mantises are a symbol of extraterrestrials because they look like extraterrestrials. And there he was in my window praying. And I went like, you know what? I'm getting some kind of message here. I'm supposed to pay attention to this, which means I will. So we're being prodded by synchronicity. That's a classic synchronicity. It was incredible. The minute I stopped thinking about it, he hopped off and went away. He sat there for 8 hours praying with his legs up like that. Jeez.
Wow.
Our soul process in dreams, as you know, we are really waking up. And yeah, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I could stand it going any faster.
You don't know what?
I don't know if I could take it if it goes any faster. The waking up.
Right.
Because of all the chaos it creates around us because of the stress for people to be changing.
Yeah. So you channel, I don't know if you still channel the Pleiadians, but they have said that they would be here to guide us through this leap that humanity's taking. Does that still apply? Are they with us?
Oh, yes. And I described a funny incident at a conference I went to one time. I went to a conference on Crete in Greece. It was a channeling conference. And we decided to have a channel panel. The person who ran the conference decided to have a channel panel. So a bunch of us are sitting up there on stage like Bashar and Barbara Marciniak and Lissa Royal, and I was there, and a bunch of well-known channels. And somebody in the audience asked that very question, and we all just said, "Hey, who do you think is sitting up here?" In other words, the Pleiadians are here. They're here through different teachers. Many, many people feel in touch with the Pleiadians, probably the Pleiades more than any other star system. So it's all happening right here. In other words, that's a code description of the fact that the higher dimensions are coming into our dimension more so every day. And they are, definitely.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting that the debate that's going on now about disclosure, we're seeing more and more words being used that are, a little bit obtuse. They're not outright denials. They're not, outright admissions, but they're leaning that way. And now the American government has, built a special page and put videos of 8 filmed incidents of unidentified flying objects, and inviting people, especially their own, military pilots, etc., to post anything that they see as well. Do you think that we are going to actually have absolute definitive proof, physical, of the existence of extraterrestrials in our lifetime?
I think we already have it. I think it's all over the place in people who study the issue, and things like Roswell, all that kind of stuff. And I think the question maybe should be, how much are we going to get of extraterrestrials in 3D? Because, see, they have dimensionality just like we do. They have 9 dimensions of awareness, as far as I can tell. And most of those dimensions aren't physical. So the question is, how much of it is going to happen in 3D? And I think we just have to watch it unfold.
Have you had any encounters?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
You have?
There's a couple of kinds of encounters. One are where beings actually manifest in your space, and I've had that happen with the Pleiadians, where they turn into kind of forms of blue light, very beautiful, send out a lot of really, really wonderful energy. So whenever they decide to show up, I couldn't be happier. I think that praying mantis is probably some sort of a manifestation too. I don't know, but I also have seen flying saucers, and no, absolutely no question they were flying saucers. One day I've lived in New Mexico for years, went away for a while, and now I've come back, and I watched a beautiful Pleiadian small saucer flying, going through the air on the way to Los Alamos. I watched it for like an hour, so yeah, I've seen things. Yeah, I've seen more than other people. I don't think so. Most people, as far as I can tell, see things. But my older brother and I watched a flying saucer over the sum of Michigan, or the mitt of Michigan, over like Alpena, Michigan. There's an Air Force base. And we saw a flying saucer for sure, because it did things that conventional craft couldn't do and still can't do. And my brother, who ended up being at Harvard Business School, he forgot about what he saw within a half an hour, and I never forgot. I see that all the time. My mother used to see things, and then the next day it'd say, "Did you remember that, Mom?" What? Our left brain blots it out.
Yeah, I'm sure. I lived in Phoenix for 10 years, and of course there'd been a lot of activity reported in Phoenix over the years. I never saw anything, despite looking all the time. But I have seen an awful lot of clouds that look very strange and look like craft.
Yeah, I see those too. We call them flying saucer clouds.
So, last question. How, looking back over the years of writing these books, how has this trilogy changed you?
I finally read Source again for this interview, and a writer finally gets to the point where they can read a book like a reader reads it. After you finish it, you're still so involved with it, you just can't get outside of it. And so I read it as a reader would read it, and I think it's marvelous. I think it's really, I think of the 3 books, I think it's the greatest one. And I don't know what to say exactly. I'm just changing or growing anyway. I mean, I'm always writing. I'll be doing more,
Well, we look forward to more. Barbara Hand Clow, thank you so much for joining us today and over the past few months to share these important stories with us.
It's been the feature of this summer. It really has been.
Thank
really
you for
been
saying
enjoyed.
that.
Really been
Yeah,
enjoyed.
I've really, really enjoyed it. So, what are you doing next?
I'm finally, as a result of this interview being completed, I can start thinking about that. And I don't know. I'm pretty active on my website right now, writing seasonal analysis, spring equinox, fall equinox, summer solstice, etc., because people need to have some understanding of what's going on. So I've been mainly focusing on that. So I don't know. I hope something creative comes in. I'll probably contact you once in a while when I run into a really great book.
Please do. Please do. And let us know when that something comes in and we can have another conversation.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank you, Barbara. So, Barbara Hand Clow is the author of numerous best-selling non-fiction books, including The Pleiadian Agenda, Alchemy of the 9 Dimensions, and Awakening the Planetary Mind, and, of course, the Revelations Trilogy, which we've been discussing over this 3-part series. And the Revelations Trilogy is published by Inner Traditions Bear & Company. For more information about Barbara, her books, her astrology, and just about everything that you can find at her website, visit handclow2012.com. That's it for this week. Thank you for your company. I hope you'll join us again at the same time next week for another edition of What is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me, and thank you again to Barbara Hand Clow.